Hello everyone. Well, it's been a while. I uploaded my last video around 7 months ago in September last year. It was a couple of months before that Bitchute demonetized my entire channel and deactivated my AdSense account. At the time I got to thinking, well, if you're going to make sure I can't make any money at all for the work I do, then I might take a break from it for a little while, ignore the steaming pile of leftist horse shit for a bit, and just have a bit of fun on my racing channel, which is what I've been doing. So I have in fact been doing stuff, just not socio-political stuff on my main channel here, or even my preferred platforms of Bitchute and Rumble, where you can still see my entire catalogue uncensored. Anyway, enough of the sentimentality. It's time to get back into it. It's no secret to sane people that one of the most disgraceful and pervasive attributes of current Western society is that of wokeness. So rather than focus on one particular event or occurrence for my first return video, I thought I'd just take a quick general look at wokeness and see if we can make sense of what it actually is. If you Google meaning of woke, one of the first hits you'll get is from dictionary.com. As a verb, a simple past tense of wake. Adjective, having or marked by an active awareness of systemic injustices and prejudices, especially those involving the treatment of ethnic, racial or sexual minorities. Disparaging, of or relating to a liberal progressive orthodoxy, especially promoting inclusive policies or ideologies that welcome or embrace ethnic, racial or sexual minorities. Slang, aware of the facts, true situation, etc., sometimes used facetiously. So without exploring numerous broader definitions, we can safely say that woke is a heightened awareness of social issues. The problem is, though, that in actuality, nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at the term objectively and truthfully, woke actually means a collective of ideologically driven, deluded individuals with a serious narcissistic personality disorder. Ah yes, I can just hear the woke now in response to that claim. Fuck you, Gary, we're going to destroy you first chance we get. Yes, I know you will, but that's just your heightened level of compassion and inclusion at work. So firstly, let's deal with the narcissistic personality disorder aspect. There's two particular areas where you can know that wokies are narcissists, even if they're too dumb to realise it themselves. The first way you can know is in the term itself, woke, and in its basic dictionary meaning. They describe themselves as woke because they believe themselves to be better educated and thus more aware of or awake to social issues than your average Joe citizen who isn't woke. In that sense, they view themselves as intellectually superior because in their minds they have a heightened or better understanding of the world in which we live. Now, there's nothing inherently narcissistic about asserting a boastful view of yourself if you can show that that view has some grounding in reality. For example, it wouldn't be narcissistic of, let's choose someone at random, Avril Lavigne, to boast of being a really successful singer-songwriter, because in reality that's actually what she is. She's not boasting as such, she's merely stating her accomplishments as fact. What defines wokies as narcissists is that the intellectual superiority of which they imbue themselves is demonstrably not grounded in fact, but is in actuality merely a delusion. You can see this plainly when you look at some of the tenets of wokeness and compare them to reality. Before we do that though, we should consider the second aspect of what defines the woke as narcissists, and that is that it's a self-identifying perceived intellectual superiority. There is no diploma of woke, no master's degree in woke, no certificate of woke, no documentation affirming woke status or license to woke whatsoever. One becomes woke because they choose to themselves. They self-identify as woke. They merely wake up one morning and decide that they are smarter and more aware than everyone else. Simply deciding that your superior is about as narcissistic as it gets. It's not the self-identifying part that's narcissistic. You can self-identify as a feminist or a men's rights advocate or an eco-warrior, but there's nothing in those titles that suggests narcissism. Yet in the case of woke, the narcissism is right there in the title itself. Woke, as an identity, literally means more awake than those that aren't woke. It pretty much can't mean anything else. Okay, so as mentioned before, Let's now use some of the tenets of wokeness to show that it's narcissism at work, not awareness at work. In other words, showing that there's no justification for them believing themselves to be more aware than others. I'd even go as far as to say that if you put your hand up as woke, what you're really telling the world is that you self-identify as one of the stupidest and most dishonest people walking on the face of the earth today. Dishonest because, 1, they deny the plain truth even when placed openly in front of them so as to uphold their ideology, and 2, their denial or avoidance of historical reality. History may be in fact the most prominent subject upon which woke people pretend to know the most, but in fact consistently prove that they know the least. Okay, so let's look at one of the foremost tenets of wokeness, that white people were the only slavers. Now, the first response of a wokey is invariably going to be, well, of course I know that whites weren't the only slavers. Okay, well, if that's the case, then why do you only assign blame for slavery to white people? It's at this point that a wokey will demonstrate their narcissism. They can't accept that they're wrong. They won't learn anything from the truth. They'll just storm off in a huff and refuse to talk about it any further. Typical narcissistic behaviour, utterly incapable of allowing anyone else to get the upper hand.
Yeah?
He's condemned white supremacy over 20 times.
Oh yes, when? Could you tell me when?
Yeah, absolutely. Would you like to see a video of montage of 20 times that he's done it?
Oh, actually no. I'm more interested in walking up in.
But how are we going to learn if we don't challenge our ideas? I mean, you just made a statement that is actually inaccurate, and I can show you video evidence of why it is. I mean, would you like to see that?
No, thank you.
I gotta go. Wait. You don't want to see the examples? I have 20 examples right here.
He is a white supremacist.
What is your basis for saying that? I have 20 examples right here. Come watch.
You must speak a lot. You can't keep covering that.
I have a video of him denouncing it 20 times. You guys want to watch the video?
Don't matter.
And there you have it. Show me the proof. Okay, here's the proof. Actually, no, I don't want to see it. And I have the proof here. And the response? It don't matter. The arguments against the woke narrative that white colonisers were the only slavers will typically be countered by pointing out how it was Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, that fought the American Civil War to end slavery in North America, setting aside that slavery was not the only issue at hand during that conflict. Yet the issue of slavery in the US was really just a carry-on from what had been accomplished in England decades earlier. William Wilberforce had campaigned for the better part of 20 years in the late 1700s and early 1800s to abolish slavery, resulting in the passing of the Slave Trade Act of 1807. The woke simply ignore the historical fact that it was whites that were the first people in history to formally abolish slavery, and in their favourite country to hate upon, colonising England. They also selectively ignore African countries with black leaders that continued slavery well into the 20th century, Ethiopia, for example.
The restoration of the Solomonic dynasty and Emperor Haile Selassie to power in Ethiopia carried a proviso from the British, who had largely restored the emperor to power. Slavery had to be banned entirely in Ethiopia. There had been piecemeal efforts at doing so as far back as the 1850s, at which time Britain was using its influence as the global superpower of the 19th century to try to curb the slave trade across Africa. These had intensified under Emperor Menelik II and during Selassie's time as regent back in the 1920s, but slavery had never fully been eradicated in Ethiopia and was still a feature of Ethiopian society when the Second Italo-Ethiopian War was initiated in 1935. The British government made it clear to Selassie that this abolition needed to continue once he was restored to power, and that he would have to take concerted steps to make a reality of that abolition. A decree was issued by the emperor to that effect in 1942, from which date we might say that slavery was finally abolished in Ethiopia.
Oh, how the truth burns, wokies. One only has to touch briefly upon historical reality, as I've just done there, to expose the woke as the most historically uneducated people on the planet when it comes to the issue of slavery. It's a fundamental truth that the only reason people of non-white heritage have such a prominent voice in today's society is because white people fought and died to have them included in the franchise of modernity. The other foremost tenet of wokeness is the issue of gender identity. Of course, like the issue of race, the woke rely on the big lie to achieve their ideological standpoint. In both cases, they ultimately had to change the true meanings of the words racism and gender to position themselves where they could espouse their bigotry towards white people and heterosexuals alike. Racism used to mean discrimination against people based on the colour of their skin, but they changed it to mean power plus privilege so that they could ameliorate their own overt racism towards white people. The same is true of the term gender, which traditionally meant biological sex, but because there is in reality only two biological sexes, they had to make gender mean something else. Both the terms racism and gender were reimagined by a bunch of pseudo-social scientists in the middle of the 20th century. Yet this reimagining has not changed the reality of human sexual dimorphism one iota. It is merely dreamed up horseshit, so that people who live in a delusional state don't have to feel burdened with the uncomfortable constraints of having to be honest about the unchangeable realities of the unchangeable. I still think that Lauren Southern's claim to gender identify as an attack helicopter is one of the greatest responses ever to the modern-day concept of gender identity. It exposes the reality that non-binary gender identity is nothing more than a complete lie, by pointing out that once you cross the boundary of truth into lie, you can identify as anything, because lies are limitless. Therefore, gender identifying as an attack helicopter is every bit as valid as a man identifying as a woman, as neither one is closer to the truth than the other. It's no secret that suicide rates are extremely high amongst trans people, but I would argue that it's not predominantly because of bigotry towards them, although that certainly can exist. I'd argue that it's the psychological ramifications of being haunted by the fact that you are living your life as a lie that contributes most to their psychological instability. On the subject of bigotry towards trans people, I'd argue that having trans ideology constantly shoved down everyone's throats by the media is the single biggest contributor towards a disdain for the tolerance of trans people. It's the ever-encroaching requirement to not only tolerate but embrace trans people that's offensive to the general public, as it is with anything that's being forced upon you. To analogise, I don't have a problem with a trans person moving into the house next door to me, but I do have a problem with being told that I must invite them into my home, feed them, and then smile while they take a shit on my lounge room floor, and then sneak off to my children's bedroom to try and convince them that I'm a toxic parent. Anyway, one could talk for hours about both race and gender issues, but the point being, and to bring it back to the core topic of this video, these points are two of the core tenets of wokeness that show how wokeness is, and of itself, toxic to society. Wokeness is in its essence untruthful, deliberately dishonest, and deeply fake in its subjective and selective narratives. Wokies profess to be the champions of tolerance and inclusion, yet consistently reveal themselves as a hateful and vengeful mob, seeking to silence and destroy all and sundry that aren't willing to submit to their falsely perceived moral and intellectual superiority.